Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Numerous developed nations across the world are seeing a birth dearth. The weak and ill are being considered burdens to be disposed of in this increasingly utilitarian society. And it's because our society has lost sight of the value of the human person. Nadya Williams joins us with a look at the roots of this ideological shift. It's a philosophical, theological problem that has permeated the entirety of society. And she also talks about how we can reaffirm the imago Dei of each person as a reclamation of the dignity of the human person. Nadya is the author of Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. She received her PhD in classics from Princeton and is a military historian of the Greco-Roman world. And after 15 years as a professor of ancient history and classics, she left academia to pursue a higher calling in her career, to be a homeschooling mother and to write for the church. She is presently a managing editor for Current, where she also edits the Arena blog. Nadya, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Nadya, I want to affirm you, not just for your decision, but also for your boldness, because like many things that as a scripture scholar, many things that I preach stands contrary to present ideological cultural movements, one of which is the dignity and the sheer height and transcendental reality of the call of motherhood, which is so profoundly disdained in the secular sphere. And I think that's a good place for us to begin in terms of framing this discussion.
Absolutely, yeah, and I appreciate this affirmation.
So let's begin there. You do a great deal in your book about talking about how secular culture has moved down the path of branding motherhood as if it's this problem that women have been plagued with. It's terrible. It's all, the kind of language that's attributed to it is it's almost like one would think motherhood was a form of shackles that women are forced with the moment they get married, and that wasn't the case for most of human history. It's just a very modern reality.
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with our modern kind of view of economic expectations. Mm-hmm. Like, what are you contributing to the GDP is a very common way to evaluate who is useful to society. Right. But even talking about people, human beings, image bearers, in terms of usefulness is going to get us down a very dangerous road, because ultimately we have to realize that it's not just mothers and children who are not going to be useful, but also like people who are chronically ill, the elderly, and so on and so forth, right. Which is why in my book I end up connecting this also to the horrors going on right now in Canada, mm-hmm. and also in the UK and Europe with euthanasia. Because if you say people are only worth what they're bringing to the society, then the equation is not good.
Completely agree. You take God out of the public sphere, and when I say that, I also mean out of the corporate imagination of the nation. And what I mean by that is now all of a sudden we have no sense of moral, even natural moral, accountability to an order that is greater than ourselves. Man inevitably devolves into productivity, into utilitarianism, into this overt expressiveness of the self. And so in the process, as you've mentioned, stay-at-home mothers and children are, quote-unquote, drains on resources within the GDP. The elderly, infants, these are categories, and those who are disabled in some way or the mentally challenged, these people become drains on resources. And so the utilitarian narrative necessitates a pushback against these subsets of the culture. And yet, throughout human civilization, what we see is the way those categories are treated defines the way a society flourishes or crumbles.
Yeah, and what is really troubling is seeing the parallels between our society right now, how we talk about people, and how pre-Christian pagans did. Right. So there's a similar kind of devaluing, mm-hmm. Which we see especially in military language in the ancient world. So this is where military history was really helpful in looking at this language, because in the ancient world, the people who were the most useful, the most important in society were those who could fight for the state in time of war. Well, so who can't fight? Women, children, the elderly. So again, they're the useless. It's really striking. Years ago, when I was working on a project on civilians in warfare, I was struck that there's no term in ancient Greek or Latin for civilians. The closest we get in one ancient military manual is the useless ones. So the author of a military manual talks about how do you manage the civilian population in a city under siege. And he explains, well, here's what the useful people will be doing. And then he says, and here's what the useless ones, like you need to assign somebody to keep them out of the way because they will only get in the way. And that is how we talk now about mothers and children.
Yes.
Like they will only get in the way. But ultimately, like the point you just made, that this is a spiritual problem ultimately. Our anthropology and our theology are inextricably connected. So to break down the 50-cent words, how we think about people is always going to be very closely connected to how we think about God.
Yep.
And if we take God out of the picture, then we can think whatever we want about people. And that is just a terrifying thought whose repercussions are even more terrifying.
Yep. And that's why a Kantian view of faith and therefore the human person and morality is so problematic. That our morality, the way we conduct ourselves, is not just, we don't do that just because there's an imperative here that we do this because we're bound to a sense of duty. It is because, even, I argue, especially when we don't understand it, there's an author who has designed the moral order, and when we adhere to it, we understand who we truly are as human persons, and we can bring about our own, as well as our own flourishing, as well as the flourishing of others. So that's why when you look at you mentioned some of these people, Betty Friedan, Helen Gurley Brown comes to mind, Margaret Sanger. When you think about these individuals and the parts that they played in rewriting the feminine narrative in society, this was under the guise of women liberation. But really what wound up happening was they shackled women to particular secular corporate expectations and therefore divorced them from the thing that they were made for in participation in the divine image, which is procreation, something that women do in a unique way that men can't participate in, this nurturing and bringing forth of children.
Absolutely. And this is where the conversation, like just this past couple of weeks about IVF really comes into play, the question of commodifying the human experience, commodifying human life, just the idea that if we want to encourage families, you can just freeze babies for whenever you choose to have them. And first of all, the science, by the way, doesn't work that way. But also, what a terrifying way of thinking about persons, just again, the commodifying the idea of this potential baby in the fridge. Really?
Yeah. And that's ugly because you bring up authors
ugly.
You bring up authors like Richard Scarry and the stories about Baby Bunny. And one of my most heartwarming memories with my son, who's only 3, is we sometimes talk about what he'd like to be in the future, and he said he wants to be a dada. It was because he and I are very close. And I have to tell you that completely melted my heart, because more than anything, I want my children to know that there's a divine intimacy at play here when mommy and daddy say yes to God for honoring the call that God has placed in our lives. But when you devalue pregnancy, motherhood, marriage, when you devalue the role of the nuclear family in society and therefore the role of womanhood, true womanhood in society, and equate women to nothing more than cogs in the GDP wheel, you've destroyed this complementarity of the human person that's so pivotal to a flourishing society and nation. Yes,
and I love this, by the way, that you and your son have that relationship. It's such it's a testament to the power of the imagination. How do we shape people's imagination towards God and towards the love of things that are ultimate, the things that are not just fashionable right now. And I think a lot of it comes into play because I was trying to think about it. Yes, on the one hand, I know that these stories, those attacks on mothers are not true, but what does it mean? Why is it harmful to have such stories around?
My guest, Nadya Williams, author of Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic. And we are talking about the reclamation of this wondrous dignity of women and families and how that's going to wind up saving society and the nation. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest, Dr. Nadya Williams, author of Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity, and the Recovery of Human Dignity. So, as we were talking, Nadya, earlier about the place of women in society, and unfortunately the Industrial Revolution and now the digital and corporate revolution has made it such that, and now you can couple this with particular narratives, right? Betty Friedan being perhaps one of the biggest voices here. We now have this misconstrued notion that the value of a woman is based on how she contributes to the bottom line of a corporation. And so when I see women say that, they find their meaning and purpose in the work that they do, clocking in and clocking out, I don't deny that you can have some level of meaningfulness in your work, but that's a far cry from, even us as men, it's a far cry from how we were designed to be.
Absolutely. And it's funny because you just mentioned the digital revolution, because ironically, I think it makes it much easier now to find your purpose in both of those things, that you can be a really engaged parent. You can be, like me, a homeschooling mom and have a writing career, and so on. There are all kinds of ways now, since the pandemic especially, to work from home and be engaged. So it's not like, in some ways, Betty Friedan had like an inkling of a problem in mind. I think she had a very flawed and utterly selfish way of resolving it.
Right.
But at the same time, she was onto something that is true. Like, God calls us into intellectual relationship with Him.
Right.
We want to do something meaningful with our minds. We don't want our lives to just be kind of sequestered drudgery.
Right.
But at the same time, she also failed to see any sort of intellectual engagement in the work of mothers, which I think is utterly false. And I've been grateful for the number of writers now who are bringing it to the fore. And I think I am as well, that motherhood is very intellectual.
Yep.
Like, there's so much that we do that requires this sort of analysis that we can bring to the table. But also, again, like, being engaged as a mother and pursuing a career of some sort is very possible from home, or in a way that does not sacrifice our children.
That's
I was
right.
thinking one of the books I read as part of research for my own book was The Baby on the Fire Escape by Julie Phillips, and she describes various great artists and novelists of the 20th and early 21st century, and in each case, these women sacrificed their children. And she's not a Christian. She's not a believer of any sort. But it's striking because at the end of each chapter, she says, well, it was worth it because she made really great art. And I was thinking, no art is worth human sacrifice.
Yep, I agree. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I couldn't agree more.
That's okay.
And you see with this great devolution of the image of motherhood and the role that motherhood plays. Sure, we had this myopic path that we led society down, and coupled with this destruction of motherhood, we saw, this overt rise in the GDP, and so productivity and flourishing and wealth. But what we're paying the price for now is this tremendous lack of being able to keep up with fertility rates. So fertility rates in developed nations across the world are less than 2.1%, and 2.1% is just replacement rate. That's including a buffer for error. It ought to be higher than that if we want to talk about continued progress. So we've shot ourselves in the foot here. But in the process, if I may appeal back to the nonsense that Simone de Beauvoir had put out, in the process of this feministic liberation that we claim to have found, we deliberately sought to erase also fatherhood. And so now it's not just fertility that's suffering, it's also the bedrock and fundamental structure of society in the family that has suffered.
Yes, and that's why I find it more productive to talk about the pursuit of human flourishing, kind of the broad issue that so often when we talk about issues of life, we focus on, like, what does it mean to be pro-life in a very narrow sense of, like, yes, let's encourage women in crisis pregnancies to keep their babies. Let's encourage parents to get married, and so on and so forth. But beyond, like, even the basics, like, what does it look like to live a flourishing life? And ultimately, we keep coming back to God's purposes for the family as something really beautiful that encourages the flourishing of both mothers and fathers and their children in community with their town, their church, and so on. And it's something that's beautiful. So as we look, like, it's no coincidence that this decline in birth rates is existing in a society that's very isolated. I mean, loneliness is now Surgeon General's warning that this is an epidemic in our society.
Right. And so when we
are killing ourselves with our choices.
Right, and so when we consider that this is our own doing, it's not like we have to look to find new solutions and novel ideas to solve this, as your education would demonstrate, but also your profound research. We have to reclaim those ideals of the past and look to history and see those eras where we saw true human flourishing and societal flourishing, and we find that it's where families have been given the avenues to flourish fully, society has flourished fully.
Yes, and that means we have to do this together. I mean, this is where the local church has a huge role to play, but also the language that we use. So I keep thinking back to kind of the way we shape societal imagination. So this is where those studies, quote unquote, the articles that criticize mothers as unproductive and so on and so forth, or talk falsely about the misery of motherhood or family life. This is where they're so dangerous because this messaging keeps catching on.
Yep. And so that's a problem, right? So you've got this societal imagination, this corporate national imagination that we're struggling with, and we have to struggle against. That imagination gives birth to a particular narrative, and these narratives need to change, which means the way we talk about certain things as Christians has to change. We need to be even the linguistic difference, because there's meaning behind the words that we employ here. Motherhood isn't, I'll give you an example. I was teaching in high school, and by the senior year, a lot of people are dating, and I had this young man tell me, well, I don't know if I want to stay with her. She has no ambition. I said, what do you mean by that? She wants to be a mom. That's it. She's got no hope for her life.
No ambition. It's like, well, I mean, but that's how he has been indoctrinated. Like, this is the language our society uses. And so in my case, even, the reactions that I got when I said that I was walking away from academia, and people were just looking at me like I was growing a second head or something.
Right. And so we've created this, we've commodified children, we've mechanized the sexual process, we have completely legalized the definition of marriage and the family, and then we wonder why human beings are being demonized. Our anthropology is essentially completely deconstructed, and we have no purpose, no way of moving forward outside of the reclamation of the one who gave meaning to human life to begin with.
Yes, that about sums it up. Yes, but again, I think there are encouraging examples of how we can do this, and this is where I see hope is in communities. Mm-hmm. So there, whenever people have asked me, well, do you see somebody who's doing this well? I always think of local churches, local communities. So a good friend of mine who lives in Connecticut and has 4 children, when I visited with her a couple of months ago, there were kids constantly running up to her door. It was a snow day, and neighborhood kids just come there. This is what a culture of a beautiful culture of flourishing looks like.
Right.
It looks like a really huge mess, potentially in my living room, because there are kids who come to play in my house. Right. It looks like kids just randomly showing up at my friend's door because they know they're welcome there to come and play. And it looks like telling mothers, the work that you do matters. Because it does. It
truly does. And so the solution here, if I'm listening to you correctly, is number 1, homeschool your children. Number 2, I mean, if it works for you, of course. Number 2, have as many. You don't have to. But number 2, have as many play dates as possible. And number 3, cooperate with your local churches.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's what it is. It's we can't do it alone.
Nadya, I greatly enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to future conversations with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
My guest, Nadya Williams, author of Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic. She received her PhD in classics from Princeton and is now a homeschooling mother, editor-in-chief, managing editor for Current, and also editor of the Arena blog. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.